Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaskar. You have stepped into a course that is going to change the way that you look at data. Not just how you analyze it, but also how you communicate it. My name is Nivid Desai. I serve as the Program Executive at Writing Studio IIT Gandhinagar. Welcome to Writing for Data Science. This course is at the intersection of analysis and communication. As all of us know, data analysis is not just about coding and models. It is about solving real-world problems. And that is exactly why every single thought that goes into solving those problems needs to be communicated. And not just to one audience, across multiple stakeholders. That is where this course comes in. This course prepares you with the foundations of writing, especially curated for data science. We will discuss audience analysis, critical thinking, logical reasoning, as well as storytelling that is native to data science. So join me on a journey at the intersection of numbers and narratives. I'll see you in class. Namaste, hello and welcome to Writing for Data Science. My name is Nivid Desai and we are on a journey to explore the interesting intersections of numbers and narratives. Since the past couple of lectures, we have been looking at a very interesting new concept called mental models. In the first lecture, while exploring mental models, we saw what a mental model is, why is it important for us to think about our audience's mental models, and what kinds of mental models there are most commonly. In the last lecture, we looked at strategies to identify our audience's mental model. And in this lecture, bringing it all together, we will look at strategies and approaches to communicate across different audience mental models. So, it ties our entire journey from understanding what a mental model is, identifying it in our audience, and then augmenting our communication to suit our audience's mental models. In the last lecture, we looked at some strategies that can help us arrive at a rather strong estimation of what our audience's mental model might be. So, in this lecture, we will begin by assuming that we have arrived at a concrete identification of our audience's mental model. So, once you have identified the mental models in play, the next challenge is bridging the gap between the audience's mental model and your communication strategy. You might be a technical expert explaining to a non-expert or a strategist explaining to an engineer. So, in this case, your job is not just to translate information from one level of proficiency to another level of proficiency. Your job is to connect your knowledge with their understanding. And that is why we will look at certain approaches today that can help us with a practical roadmap to connect our knowledge with our different audiences' understanding. And we will ground this understanding in mental models. So let's begin with the first approach. The first approach tells us to use layered explanations. We begin with a high-level idea for outcome or story-based readers and then layer it with how it works for functional readers, and finally, why it matters ethically or in the long term for value-driven readers. So this ensures that our bunch of information that we are supposed to communicate to a certain audience group helps them identify the certain information that they are most concerned with. Layering these kinds of information will help them not just locate the information that concerns them, but also the kind of approach to communication that they are most comfortable with. For example, to explain a new algorithm to a general audience where you may or may not know if people will have the same mental model across the entire vast trajectory of audiences, you start with this algorithm helps recommend job listings based on your past interests. So, this is a high level view. It gives you an overall scope of what the algorithm does. Then you move on to it looks at patterns in your history and compares them with other users. This is more about the functionality, how it works. And you end it finally with we have tested it to avoid suggesting biased or irrelevant options. This last sentence appeals to a value based audience. Mind you, this is when you may not be fully aware if a group of audience has the same mental model. Therefore, you have layered this knowledge, you have layered this explanation with different approaches one after the other, depending on which information will cater to which mental model the best. At this stage, let us look at the first point of reflection for today. Why do you think is it helpful to build information in layers instead of delivering it all at once? What difference does it make to start layering different bits of information instead of communicating it as an entire chunk? Again, there is no such thing as a correct or incorrect answer. I just want you to exercise that critical thinking muscle that we have been developing as we have been exploring different topics. Think about what this means to you. Think about why you think it may be important. And I will get back to you with the second approach very soon. The second approach helps us extend our skills from the first approach. The first approach told us to layer our information with different types of mental models, while the second approach goes a little further. It tells us to translate between different models. We have seen that analogies help story based and non technical audiences understand complex systems. Visuals help all audiences process relationships quickly. These are tools that can help us translate a domain specific knowledge to something more applicable and more appealing. So, in case if you have to translate your knowledge, something that is domain specific, there are tools that help us compare that with our intended audience's mental models. Two of them present over here are analogies and visuals. Let's look at an example. Let's say you are explaining a machine learning model. If you are in fact a technical communicator, your inclination would be to explain the machine learning model something like this. The model uses decision trees with ensemble boosting. However, if you look at this sentence, the first thing that pops out is that it is dense with jargon. That's one thing which may not be appealing to somebody who does not have the technical domain knowledge. So, how do you convert it? How do you translate it into a story based analogy? Let's look at a possibility. It is like asking five experts their opinion and going with the majority. You see, you have turned this into something concrete, something practical, and something that most audiences would understand in an instance. This is where you compare a technical domain specific information with a lived experience, something that may be common across different audience groups. Then, when you have to make sure that this relationship is commonly accessible across different types of mental models, you start using visuals. So, a flowchart showing how predictions are refined over multiple rounds may be helpful in understanding the relationship between different data points. Let's do a little exercise at this point. Let's try and explain a technical concept from your domain using a real world analogy. If you remember, this analogy part, we have been carrying it forward ever since our lesson in first principles reasoning. So, at this stage also, I would invite you to start thinking from first principles and develop a real world analogy for something that you have technical domain expertise in. So, try and figure out a topic that may be specific to you, but you may have to explain it in a real world analogy term based on first principles. It'll be fun. The third approach teaches us to strike a rather sensitive balance. The reader may have their own mental model. We may have our own mental models, possibly also different from our readers. So, if you want to appeal to the reader's mental model, the most obvious way of doing so is playing by their rules, respecting their mental models, and augmenting our communication to suit the way that they prefer. However, is our job as a communicator only to cater to our audience's interests? Not entirely. If you are a critical thinker turned communicator, you may also feel the need of expanding your reader's worldview, gently trying to push them forward towards new possibilities of thinking. Therefore, the third approach teaches us to respect the reader's model while gently expanding it. Avoid dismissing a reader's view. Instead, validate what they already know and introduce new layers of understanding. For example, if a stakeholder says, "I'm worried AI just copies bias from the past," I understand that if you know AI at a deeper level, our instinct may be to say, "It's not that simple. Don't try to simplify it and look at it from a hostile point of view. I get it. This may be the first instinct because we may understand AI at a deeper level. However, it is important to make our entire communication reader centric. So, we don't outrightly discard the reader's point of view. Instead, we say that that's a real concern and one that we address. How do we address it? We use bias detection tools that check for unfair patterns and flag them early. So, we are not discarding the reader's concerns, we are instead addressing them and resolving them in the process. So, the reader's concern does not cease to exist, it actually gets resolved with the kind of point that you are putting forward. So, if you look at it, this second possibility has acknowledged the reader's mental model and, after having resolved the problem, gently expanded the reader's worldview. So now the reader knows that the bias possibility of AI can be mitigated by bias detection tools that can check for unfair patterns and flag them early. Maybe the reader may not be aware of this possibility technically, but because you were not only informative but also kind in your communication, the reader's concerns are resolved instead of seized. That is what matters. That is what makes you a critical and compassionate communicator at the same time. And I would like you now to think about this quick reflection question. Why do you think is it important to validate what your reader already believes, even if you are introducing a more complex explanation? If you think about it, there may have been many instances in both your and my life where somebody would have told us that it's not as easy as you think. It's not as simple as you think. What do you know about the complex matters, right? These are all rather dismissive statements. They make us feel small. They make us feel inferior. So, even if we are catered with new information, it doesn't stick instantly because the emotional weight of having been insulted, having been disgraced, having been taken lightly still lingers while new information is trying to barge in. So, think about it from an empathetic point of view. Develop a point of view of your own. Why is it important that we validate what the reader believes, even if we are about to introduce something more complex? Make some notes. It'll be important in building our competency as a compassionate communicator. I'll be back with the fourth approach very soon. The fourth approach is a rather interesting method. You offer different entry points for different readers. If you think about it, we looked at translating our information across different models previously. This is an extension of the same. Offering different entry points for different readers ensures that we have everybody on board when they are trying to access our information. In reports or presentations, create sections or formats that speak to multiple mental models. Stay with me. It is about to remind you of the structures that we have previously studied. For executives, a summary may be more important. This will be for the outcome-driven mental model. Then, a method section for analysts, which is the functions-driven mental model. Then a case study for the general audience, which is the story-based mental model. And an impact note for public or ethical review. This is the values-based mental model. We have studied all of this and more in detail while we were looking at structuring reports for technical and non-technical audiences. So, you may remember that we looked at the utility of different sections and different chapters of catering different types of information. If you think about it, you can also look at the same structure from this point of view. Each different heading, each different section is a different entry point for a new kind of reader. So, if they fall into different categories of mental models, they can approach the kind of information that best suits their worldview. And we cater all of them together by different sections and different chapters. I'll give you an example. In a report on a hiring algorithm, this is what an outcome-based sentence may look like. It reduced time to hire by 35%. This is more about the result of the algorithm. Then the function-based. It used resume parsing plus clustering. This will be more attuned towards analysts or engineers who are trying to get to the methodology of how the algorithm functions. Then look at a story. We tracked one applicant's entire journey. This is for story-driven case studies, non-technical audiences, but executive audiences who would like to see how it actually transpires in real life. And you end it with the values. We monitored for demographic fairness. This is for policy analysts. This is for ethics compliance. So, the same thing can be explained by different entry points across a written document, trying to invite different readers to interact with the kind of information that they are looking for. Let's do a little exercise to understand this better. You can choose a topic, for example, a recommendation engine or a fraud detection technique, and then write one sentence for each type of mental model: the outcome-driven, the functional, the story-based, and the value-based. These four mental models have been the pillars of how we understand our audiences, so try and break down one concept into 4 different entry points, one sentence each, not more than that, but try to see the kind of audiences that each of these different sections may attract. I hope that was a fun exercise for you, and now I have a quick reflection question. Now that we have looked at mental models at large, can you think about the one way that you will change how you communicate next time, knowing what you know now about mental models? We are on the brink of completing our entire discussion on mental models, so I would like you to pause for a moment and reflect on the changes that you are going to accommodate in your entire communication style. I hope that we have learned to become more deliberate, more thoughtful, and more considerate of the kind of information that our audience is looking for, and we resolve to accommodate different audiences based on our communication design. So, in conclusion, we have spent 3 lectures looking at mental models and their different kinds of nuances. Mental flexibility and reflexivity builds communication power. What do I mean by these 2 words? Flexibility and reflexivity, both of them show that you can adjust your communication based on the kind of audience variables that may be in front of you. To be a great data communicator, it is not just enough to know your material. You must understand how others understand and then work backwards to accommodate their understanding within your knowledge. By learning to identify mental models and communicate across them, you gain the flexibility to reach any audience with empathy, clarity, and impact. This is what truly makes you a dynamic communicator. And we have learned across this entire module to look at our audience as an active stakeholder in all the communication that we do. Remember, we discussed reader-centric writing. This is the crux of reader-centric writing, to reach out to any audience we wish to with empathy, clarity, and impact. With that, we bring the entire discussion on mental models to a close. In fact, we are inching closer to the conclusion of our entire module on audience analysis. The next 2 lectures are going to be a 2-part discussion on synthesizing everything that we have learned, a quick recall of the key concepts that went by us in the last few lectures, and learning how to connect our broader understanding to day-to-day implications so that our knowledge just doesn't remain theoretical. It also translates into practical skills. So, the next 2 lectures are going to be a 2-parter synthesis of our entire long conversation on audience analysis. I hope that this entire module has opened you up to new possibilities and perspectives. In the next 2 lessons, we will look at how the whole thing makes sense from a bird's eye point of view. I hope that you stick around for that. Thank you so much for joining me today. All the best, stay curious, keep learning. I'll see you in the next class. Thank you so much for joining me today. Namaskar.